There we go. And without further ado, Mark, take it away.
Hey, great. The weather's nice, so I'm assuming fewer people will be here, but it's great to everyone. This is an interesting topic that I personally thought was appropriate to start going over. Uh, so we'll dive in. Spring weather is always challenging. It can be just about everything from icing to thunderstorms to just rain or nice weather. So success for us in all these is just making sure we're flying more and we're flying more safely. We're working on building out a safety resource center at Air Care Alliance. So if anyone that wants to help, please let us know. So again, format here is to share experiences. I'm a commercial pilot. I'm not an instructor, but we do have instructors on our panel here. So we should be able to answer most questions and give guidance that hopefully everyone finds useful. So we're trying to make our happy place, and doing a lot of volunteer flights and cross-country flights is our happy place in the volunteer community, but I'm sure overall. And so we do need your help. Air Care Alliance does have a YouTube channel. We're trying to get all of these webinars posted there as well as other safety content. So please take a look. It's hopefully going to grow. Everyone from the FAA we just mentioned. The panelists tonight, Carly, STEM Flights, Rob from Angel Flight East, Lex, who's Superman, doing DP work as well. So, and Trevor, who just joined us. Obviously, the Wings program, very important. We would like all of our volunteer and GA pilots to be participating in the Wings program. It can only make you safer, tons of free courses. Again, I think we find it very, very useful. Did you know I've changed the graphic this month? The green is the darker the green, the more medical services are missing out of a list of 7 medical. So you can see most of the country has areas missing some kind of medical service. Could be a pharmacy, could be general, clinic, could be a hospital. The dark ones are missing all 7 items. So again, very important to understand that there's a need that we can fulfill with our airplanes to get people to service. So again, the rest of our numbers, Carly's near and dear number, there's 1,400 high schools participating in STEM programs, but there's 27,000 high schools. So we've got a bit of work to do to get awareness out there. So this is a quick fun one, personal trip. This last week, I flew from Boston to Burbank, California. But my route was interrupted by a number of things. The red thing is weather, and the yellow thing was me planning for wildlife scenarios just because of where things were reported to have wildlife activity. So I did have to deviate to get through this little crack, which turned out to be building thunderstorms in the first leg. And by the time I was getting to Pueblo, Colorado, it was immersed in thunderstorms. So I ended up in Amarillo, Texas. So, when you're doing long cross countries, especially in the US, you're going to get many different types of weather on the way, and you can't get there-itis. You've got to just give up to the weather gods. So Grand Canyon National Airport, I assumed there would be a ton of wildlife. There wasn't, but the yellow lightning bolts are where I did see birds on short approach, making it a fun, slightly dodging experience. So there we go. And then the other thing in the spirit of ATC can help and you can help ATC, this crack of building thunderstorms was actually over here by the time I got there. And, I just agreed I could skirt it safely, but here this was building and they warned me of moderate to heavy rain. And I said, well, why don't you just give me a vector to get around it instead of me flying through it? So air traffic control was extremely accommodating instead of just warning me, assisting me in getting around stuff. So this is this morning. This is Van Nuys Airport in California. Extremely urban area in Los Angeles. I'm sure Trevor knows this airport pretty well. This morning we had an interesting event. They closed one of the 2 parallel runways because a coyote was being chased by airport traffic control truck, and I was on not quite short approach, and my landing clearance was canceled, but said continue, and they were hoping to have successfully chased the coyote off the runway by the time I was getting too close, and they were, and they reinstated my clearance. So doesn't matter where you are, urban environment, rural environment, wildlife is going to be a fun thing. And that's consistent with our discussion last month, being sensitive to where that stuff is going to be. So I'll go over that. So one of the things that came up during the call last month and then afterwards in some emails were, how do you report a strike? There is this website, wildlife.faa.gov, and there's a place to report a strike if you do ever have one. You know about volunteering. If you don't know about volunteering, you should. You can go to our website. This is over here. Um, any plane, any pilot, you can find a way to volunteer. And even if you don't have a plane, you can be a ground support person and drive people to medical support or animals to a flight. This is one of the projects we're working on now in our safety team. We've started to design a lanyard card that we will be handing out, encouraging everyone to use acronyms to make sure that you've done good flight prep before you take off. And we're going to be working on a new checklist for people doing public benefit flying. And anyone that may want to help on that, please let us know. Organizations highlighting this month, Pilots and Paws, great national organization. If you think it doesn't matter what kind of airplane you have, there's an animal somewhere in the country that can probably benefit from flying them away from a kill shop or getting to a forever home. Angel Flight West, largest of the volunteer groups in the US, has a huge territory, including Alaska and Hawaii. Again, if you're in this part of the US and don't know about them, you should. They do about 6,000 missions a year. And again, great organization to work with. And I've done my first 2 flights for them today and 6 days ago. Lifeline Pilots in the center of the US, they also do a great job. They've grown over 500% in recent years. Same type of mission, medical missions, and trying to eliminate transportation as a barrier to healthcare. Let's get into our weather discussion, the 20-mile rule. I wonder how many people live by this 20-mile rule. I see airliners probably not living by this rule when I'm flying. So we want to stay at least 20 miles away from an active thunderstorm. Not sure how many people ever get this stress, but to stay away from the downwind side. Never fly under the anvil. It took probably 3 years of flying before someone really stressed how important it is not to fly under the anvil. And I can go over a personal example there. And then never fly between 2 thunderstorms. I've had air traffic control many more than one time, many times tell me, oh, it looks like there's a gap here you can fly between. And I'm looking out the window and saying, these are storms to 40,000 feet. I don't think I want to fly in that gap. I'll take a little bit longer, go around them, and then continue on. So it is tempting, especially when you see someone else do it and their plane doesn't get struck by lightning. I don't think it's worth it, and I usually take a very long route around. Obviously, never go into a thunderstorm. There are fewer stories in the old days, but I do have a friend that got stuck penetrating a thunderstorm when he had forgotten that XM weather was not a real-time avoidance product, that it was more of a strategy product, and got caught in a strong downdraft and was about to pull the parachute and luckily popped out and was able to continue on, but learned the lesson to not use XM weather as a tactical tool. And I've got to say, in my early days of flying, I flew under thunderstorms, especially Florida, using rain as the way to avoid it. I since learned not to do that. Oh, you never know where the downdrafts are. But again, part of the basic set of rules that I'm not sure everyone gets training around when it's thunderstorm season, especially in the spring. Before we get into some of the examples, I thought I would share what Boston and New York airspace looks like on a regular basis, not for the faint of heart. And there's certain gateways that are not necessarily published anywhere, and there can be letters of agreement between controller sections on how they're going to route traffic coming from certain corridors. The top one is a very common one for us. If we're coming from the west into the Boston area, you actually go higher than this up here. And then for us, we have to fly all the way around the city at 3,000 feet to get to our home airport. Um, and if you want something different than that approach, they're reluctant to give it to you. And the same thing from New York. If you're coming from certain areas, you'll fly this way into the airspace. And if you're coming from the south, you almost always get this gate. But what happens when there's storms in the way? I mean, that's where you as pilot in command can help air traffic control because they have certain routes they're trying to keep everybody on, just given the sheer number of planes in the sky in any given area. Um, and you want to be sensitive to that and figure out how to help them to not get in their way. So I'll go over two scenarios that I flew. One was actually in a Cirrus, and then the other one was in the jet. So um, the first one is um, is going through a thunderstorm or trying to avoid going through a thunderstorm, and the route from New Jersey to Boston or near Boston was going right through a squall line, and they were routing people that way and assuming that you would just sort of figure it out. So instead of having to deal with that with passengers on board, um, and what this isn't depicting is the lightning strikes that you could see on the other weather products. Um, I filed for Plymouth, Massachusetts, which was way out of the way over here, and was able to then ask for a redirect once I was in the air on the way and, get diverted into my airport. Um, so air traffic control was happy. I didn't get caught in trying to make last minute decisions, trying to go through this squall line. The other example here is in the jet coming from the west. They wanted me to go to Gardner and then fly around in these thunderstorms. So long before I got there, oops, let's go back here. Long before I got caught into this gateway, they said, "Hey, let me fly south and I will go around the end of the storm instead of trying to, get in the way of all these other planes that are trying to also deviate around the storm line." So they said yes, and were appreciative of the fact that I asked for something that was reasonable for their routing. But I did it very early. I did it close to 200 miles early. And that's what this one was. It was a very long flight with passengers on board, trying to not get them bounced around. So again, being proactive with ATC and trying to understand what their limitations are through letters of agreement that we don't get to see is something that we can do. I did try to have two controllers on tonight, both ended up working. And they agree with basically what I'm saying here is, try to work by coming up with routing that does not place the burden on air traffic control. And you're not trying to solve for this in the air, close to where the storms are happening. Try to do this as far in advance as possible, including, making it easier filing before you even take off. Hey, Lex, do you see any of this in your, longer cross countries and other sections?
Definitely. If you wait until the last minute, you're going to get an unable, and then you're up against the wall, and you either have to fly through the weather, which isn't a good idea, or declare an emergency. Also throws a wrench in the works. So
Yeah,
absolutely a
definitely
problem.
does. Hey, Trevor, how about in the Northwest? Do you have this a lot where you have letters of agreement on certain routing and you have to then come up with plans to get around it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, going up and down the West Coast, I'm in Seattle, but Seattle to Portland to the Bay Area to LA is definitely preferred routing. We don't deal with as much convective activity on the West Coast, but in some ways that can be a trap because we still do get it in the summer and it can be very spontaneous. And suddenly we're trying to route around stuff that we didn't expect and it's popping up. So yes, definitely.
Cool, thanks. So here's a recent three-leg flight that I did that was a long day flight. And it's an example of you can have the best plans in mind, but it doesn't work out because your passengers or other things impact your best intentions. Um, so morning departure, squall line delayed, and then the forecasted winds were way off. So there was super high winds. There was no forecast for ice, but of course there was ice on the climb out. Um, getting to the airport to pick them up. This was a pickup in Ohio. Passenger was dropped on the wrong side of the airport. Another delay. And the forecast originally had been for scattered thunderstorms in the afternoon. So my goal was to get this flight over with before noontime, so the isolated or the scattered storms didn't have a chance to really get going. And then of course on the leg with the passenger, the routing they gave me added 30%. So another delay. So everything was not going my way. The the airport that I was flying in to pick this person up, this veteran, was a training airport in Ohio. It had a gazillion people in the pattern as well as waiting to take off, and they were all slow movers. So that was causing another delay. So during the routing, and I'll go over this in a second. So again, negotiated with air traffic control to help avoid the bumps and avoid getting put into convective weather. I think people understand this, but maybe not much. But you'll see storms that are building but don't show up on their radar yet. So they're going to point you towards something that you don't want to fly into, and not because they are being malicious. They just don't see it. So part of your role is to make sure you're letting them know how to help you. And that was something early on that I had to learn as a lesson instead of getting bounced around. So in this one, just I'll go over more detail on this flight in a second, but in this one, things that I could do better definitely was make sure the passenger knows where they're going. I've had a number of my 500 plus flights where passengers just end up in the wrong place. I could have been better at anticipating what happens if I started having delays, but it was spring and I wasn't anticipating that there was going to be that much building, thunderstorm activity yet, but a bit wrong. And I held up waiting for a GPU to start the airplane, but I was number 3 in line, so I decided not to do that. But did well, and I'll show you some of the things that we ended up doing here. So, not sure, Lex, do you guys go over this much in training in the CSIP program, where you're going over the definitions of things like isolated, scattered?
Well, in general weather training, absolutely. Certainly a lot of emphasis on instrument rating training as well.
Yeah, I couldn't remember getting much of this when I was going through training. I was just curious how much it's made it into.
Well, there's also confusion about what few and broken and scattered mean with clouds,
Yeah, and that's why I thought it was important to include the formal definition here. And it's not telling you exactly where they're going to happen. It's just telling you that the type of collection there's going to be. So obviously numerous and widespread is not a good thing. Isolated and scattered, I typically will fly in, but some of the scattered end up being mini squall lines where they're connected. So it can make it not feel like it's a scattered area. So again, here's an example of a multi-cell scattered eligible radar image, but I'm not sure I would want to be flying through this. I would give this a wide berth. So again, you can get really lulled into thinking that you can do something because it's isolated or scattered, but it could be just not doable. So again, isolated, this is another example. This should be a no-brainer to stay away from. This, not so much, even though this qualifies as scattered. And this is an outlook. So the outlooks are just, again, estimating which type of thunderstorm cluster there's going to be. It's not guaranteeing that this area is wide, as would be considered widespread. I wouldn't fly in that area. But typically, if it's yellow or green, it would be something I would be considering looking at because I have a mission bias that I've made it work in the past. Um, this right-hand picture is an example of a squall line. The squall lines can be hundreds of miles long and can be, but are typically, 10 or 20 miles wide. Um, and this would be indicative of something that could have tornadoes affiliated with it. It's got usually this U-shaped bow to it. So these, I don't know about you, but I have an example of flying back from Kansas City to Boston, seeing one of these lines, and I have a mentor pilot, and we're getting closer and closer. And I said, hey, all I see is a wall. What am I supposed to do here? And he said, oh, we'll just wait for them to tell us where the airliners are getting through, and we'll use that same track. So I said, okay. So I then proactively called up ATC and I said, where are the airliners going? And they said, oh, you'll be the first to go through it. So I said, okay, I don't, my mentor is with me and I said, I'm not going to fly through this. And then all of a sudden we see a crack and we just fly through the crack and air traffic control says, congratulations, you're the first. But I doubt that the crack was the obligatory 40-mile or 20-mile rule thing. So I soon after that just determined that my mentor had to be more than one person because I had a charter mentor that was very aggressive and was used to having get-there-itis. And, he was, almost 80, so he had seen a lot of things. So he may have a little bit too much confidence at times. So again, common sense should prevail. And I've sat many a time on the ground in Florida or stayed overnight to avoid having to go across one of these things. So again, the formal definitions, sure, you guys can find them if you want to look, but again, anything with 3, 4, or 5, really have to be seriously considering what you're capable of doing. The type of damage that can occur is not trivial. And hail on your airplane is not something you want to see. I saw a plane that had hail damage and they were replacing the wings. So, so again, just a description of what to expect in these. And again, I would question whether even 1 or 2 is good to go in depending on your area. So this is the squall line that I was facing that morning before I took off in that first leg to Ohio. And that's why I just waited on the ground. It wasn't worth trying to see if I could be the first to go through that. This is the leg with the next leg 2, with the passenger. And this was just building and it wasn't even on radar when I had done this first leg down. So they were trying to put me through. This had moved south by the time, so this isn't necessarily accurate. They were trying to put me through this gap and I could look out the window and just said, no, I just need to go. And they eventually helped by they were proactive and finally agreeing with me and gave me a waypoint on the arrival that worked out perfectly. So air traffic control, once you said no, out the window doesn't look acceptable, they were quite proactive in offering how to help. But if you look, this will give you an idea of how quickly things are forming. At this point, Boston was clear, except for these 2 little pops of cells. So on leg 3, I had to just, I waited for the passenger to get a ride and the ride had been messed up. So that added another half-hour delay to my multiple delays of the day already. And the afternoon areas of scattered and isolated thunderstorms started popping up in very fast order. And as I showed you before, the New York and Boston airspace is extremely busy. And the cells that had popped up were going over, of course, my exact route of flight. And I was trying to decide whether I wanted to do that, deal with it in the air, or refile and go to another place. And this is getting proactive, say refile to a place that's out of the way. So I went to get my clearance, and clearance said, no, they're going to, no matter what I do, they're going to revert you back to the usual routing. You should take off and deal with it in the air. Which I don't generally like to do, but I was on leg 3 without a passenger and I wanted to go home. So I had a little bit of get there-itis. So I'll show you in a second why I asked for a southerly deviation, because that was the alternate routing that I was trying to get to, and air traffic control said no. So that was not another answer I was expecting, and that was because there was a gazillion airliners also trying to go to Boston at the same time on the same route, all asking for southerly deviations. So I was proactive and offered them a non-standard route to the north and asked to go higher to get above the weather. And they actually, the controller was sounded overwhelmed by the number of planes having to ask for deviations, said, okay. And I think that meant that I was getting handed off to another sector, which was probably helping that controller, but it was in a not very much a non-standard direction away from where all the problems were happening. And I offered to do a very fast descent after I got past the weather, if that would help them. And I ran into still pockets of very heavy rain and an IMC approach, but that was much better than flying through thunderstorms. So again, make sure your passengers have transportation, confirm that. It's crazy how ground things can impact your flight. And look at, fatigue is an issue after a long day of flying. And I probably could have these storms are typically fast movers. Isolated thunderstorms in particular don't have long lives. And what I didn't do is call the home base to see if there was any weather delays from the other direction. And I'll go over that in a second. So I think I'll skip this one. That was just sort of going over all the delays that kept happening to me, which was one of those days where nothing was going right. And again, this is an example of the airspace that we're flying in the Northeast. There's just the poor controllers. Once something starts going wrong, there's a cascading list of issues. And Lex, I'm sure you've seen this a lot. And
yeah, it gets really awful.
It can get awful quickly, and you can't do much about it. And I've seen some airliners that go through this stuff just because they haven't got cleared and not, complaining in very loud terms. So this is what the weather had sort of built into, and the route of flight was taking me through this line, which isn't significantly depicted. This had lightning in it, and I was trying to get here. So the route I offered was to go literally due north, away from everybody, which was away from all the arrival corridors. And I had never done this ever. Just said, okay, what's the best way to get away from all the problems? And that seemed to work. Let's see here. So this is what I ended up doing. I went due north. They didn't make me go all the way. Found a crack, flew through the crack, did a dive bomb for the airport to get close enough to pattern altitude to make it all work, and did a regular approach into the airport. So the important lesson here was don't wait for air traffic control. They have really good intentions, but they do hit a saturation point, and you can sort of hear it when it's happening. And be proactive and creative about offering in very few words an alternative to get yourself away from all the problems that are occurring. And that worked. So here they gave me this waypoint instead of all the way up to Worcester. They wanted me to go this way, and I said no. I waited until I actually saw a real crack that I could believe in and went down. So again, air traffic control was helpful, and And once you again can get proactive, it helps a lot. So here's the cell after it had gone by, and this had filled in. This is more accurate representation of how solid that cell was. And it had been right over my arrival. So if I had only waited another hour and a half, it all would have been gone and it would have been no big deal at all. So I would not have needed any deviations. So I'm not sure how many people look at the airspace delays that you can look up. You can look up the system overall status, and they'll publish ground delays, and you can look at. So here's an example in the Boston airspace. There was a ground stop. So you know that the controllers are saturated if they're stopping things on the ground due to the weather. So I did not check that. That's usually on my checklist of things to do, and I was definitely in get home ITIS mode. This is something that everyone can do if you see a lot of weather, or start checking major airports around. And if you see that there's ground stops or delays, you'll know that air traffic control is getting saturated. I was in Virginia once trying to get from Norfolk, Virginia back to Boston. And all kinds of planes were being diverted. There were squall lines. And they gave me a routing from Virginia to Ohio to upstate New York back to Boston. So, and they said if I took that, they would let me go. And that more than doubled my flight time, which meant I was going to run out of fuel during the flight. So, so I said yes, assuming I would be able to beg my way out of having to fly double the amount of air miles. But instead of, and I don't have that one up here, but instead of them giving me a route that was ahead of the squall line, they turned me directly towards the squall line. And I was like, what are they doing? And so I told air traffic control, why are you turning me? You're turning me into the storm. I can see the lightning. And they said, oh, we see a crack. I said, no. No, and that's, and I did a U-turn and I said, no, I'm not going that way. We can figure something out. And they did. They figured it out. But they had good intentions, but you're a pilot in command, and your job is to make sure you don't do something that clearly is wrong just because air traffic control is using their best effort to get you somewhere. So, and again, this is how you can get into the system status information. So no questions on that one. It's ongoing. So this one
questions
is
yet.
No questions yet. This is an interesting spring weather one. It's very unfortunate. And this happened the day I was in Amarillo, Texas. I went in the opposite direction of what this particular flight went in. It was very late at night, and left from Amarillo. The pilot was current. The plane was well kept. Was supposedly well kept. Not a lot of data on that. And they were taking 4 pickleball players to a tournament, so they sort of had the pressure of getting the people to the tournament for the next day. But everything, the plane had been used in the last couple of days. Very common plane. Probably human factors, mission bias, and overconfidence. If you're based in Texas, you're used to flying around weather. The weather forecast was really heavy, pretty typical. That night before I left, it was, thunderstorms, isolated thunderstorms all over the place. In the immediate area where this was flying, there was lightning everywhere, gusty winds. Pretty typical was scattered and isolated thunderstorms. And the forecast, again, was IMC all the way up to flight level. This was when I took off at 8:30 in the morning. They already had clouds all the way up to 31,000 feet, light ice in the climb. So we already knew there was water in the clouds. So the general discussion was definitely going to have tons of thunderstorms flying around. and gusty winds, which is common when you have these isolated cells building up quickly in Texas. So this particular route of flight, they were going to here, and there was going to be this line of weather, which is underrepresented. So there's the audio finally came out on this, and the pilot reported just after getting to cruise that the pitot tube was iced up, and they turned. If you look at the weather here, they went down here and turned back into the weather, and then turned towards getting out of the weather. But this was probably now an active thunderstorm by then. So they ended up getting caught in what looks like a flat spin, and they don't know anything else. So this is one of those ones where why would you press forward with that kind of weather review? It's the rate of change in that kind of weather is not good. Having a pitot tube freeze up, those planes I thought had more than one, but apparently this only had one pitot tube, so there was no backup. So a single point of failure. So a lot of times the question is anyone, especially if you're flying a lot and have confidence in your plane, are you really doing a pitot tube heat check before you take off? It's something that I know we all get beaten up on in training, but if you're, have confidence in your equipment, what do you do?
Mark, I did hear too that they found that the tail was separate to the main part, so there was an in-flight breakup apparently as well. So.
Yeah, if we go back and look at that picture, I didn't see the tail here either, and I didn't see that additional comment. But
yeah, I saw a picture with someone finding the tail in a separate neighborhood. So
yeah,
just adds to the tragedy.
It's just you could see if it's in a flat spin, it's going to be beyond the structural limits of the plane. So too bad again. I think totally preventable. And we all get, like I just said in the example before, tempted into doing things that maybe we shouldn't be doing, or could do in a more optimal way. So this one's near and dear to me because it made me think a lot when it did happen, and I thought I would spend time on this because this was a totally preventable situation, where a pilot unfortunately lost himself and his family a number of years ago. This is the month when I got my type rating in the eclipse. So very sobering for me to think about how this would happen to someone and what training meant to this particular person. So IFR flight plan, pretty long flight, 4 hours en route, rain in the beginning. The forecasts were pretty accurate. There was an air met for light to moderate icing. Only one pirate though for light rain. And the Pilatus is a very capable airplane. It's not superhuman, but it's got boots and de-ice equipment, and it has a very good reputation. This was an older plane with older avionics, and this is the route of flight showing the weather at the time that they were going. This is again usually a little off if you get it out. This is another depiction. And this is what the panel would have looked like in that vintage of a Pilatus. So very busy panel, garment, but capable. Digital autopilot, onboard radar, onboard storm scope, enough to let you know to do strategic planning on how to avoid the weather. Go back for a second. This is the throttle quadrant. If you're a piston pilot, this person had a background flying Bonanzas. So very different than what you'd expect in a Bonanza. And again, very different controls. So the pilot was not that old, but it was 45, class 3, didn't have a lot of hours. The majority of hours were in a Bonanza, so not a high performance model. I had sold this plane 2 years prior. These recent hours were all at SimCom and training. And in that amount of time, he only got 4 hours of actual IMC, and he had less than one IMC in his 8 years prior to that. So very little time in IMC or any kind of challenging weather. So we had a single engine Bonanza. SimCom training had been in May. I'm not sure. I did SimCom 3 times in 3 years, and I was at SimCom in June of 2012 doing my type rating, and didn't spend a lot of time on personal minimums. For me, everything was in the simulator. Didn't spend any time at all on pre-flight weather planning. So it was kind of an interesting experience, wondering how much this guy had gotten for exposure to dealing with flying higher, dealing with weather, and just staying ahead of the plane and making your game plan before you got going. So I doubt that was getting much attention. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to actually comment here too. So if you go to the NTSB reports on these kind of things, there's a lot of data you can read. And if you have the time to read some of these reports all the way through, you'll find nuggets. So one of them was an interview of his partner who was getting his clearance or transition training at the same time, but he had a lot of time in pressurized planes. He mentioned to the NTSB interviewer that his partner probably needed more time. So he got an extra 6 hours of training, and was signed off. But that was, again, likely not going over weather planning. It was just going over button pushing and knowing how to fly the plane to some minimum level of performance. And when you read things like that, you wonder, why someone's not being more specific about where the training gaps can be for someone coming out of a single engine piston plane going into a turboprop that's flying, 10 to 15,000 feet higher all the time. So it made me, again, think very hard about, again, those issues when I was going. So here's the flight. So almost immediately coming off the runways, getting a warning about heavy rain in the route of flight. So if it's that quick, you should already know what your avoidance game plan is. You shouldn't be having to now start working on what you're going to do to get out of the way of the weather. So this is the first indication that maybe not as prepared as you should be. It's a very busy time. Entered IMC almost immediately, gets another warning in less than 4 minutes that there's weather in the way. And you'll see in a second here. Let's go down here. So air traffic control gave them north of course deviations, but internally it turns out that they realized that south would have been better. So then they gave another set of hints that they should be going south away from the airport. But there was a 2-minute lapse here. So meanwhile, the PIC is not determining where they really want to go and have a plan. They're reacting instead of driving. So these are the transcripts from the audio. So it's clear that by 15 or so minutes into the flight, the pilot's still very far behind, agreeing that they probably should have gone to a different course. Does turn on the prop de-ice, but not the boots, and is in IMC this entire time. So they made it to near the tops of the clouds, but not all the way. And for some reason got off autopilot and got into this spiral, which could have been convective weather because there was huge variabilities in descent and ascent. But they oversped the airplane, and the airplane broke up in flight. So this is the end result. So clearly preventable with an action plan that would have started before you take off. There's some interview of people talking to the pilot before, while he and his family were eating before they were taking off, and he seemed not worried about the weather at all. I mentioned that there might be some bumps on the climb out, but nothing more. So clearly didn't have a weather plan. So something else that was kind of telling from the scene, this came out of, this is buried in the NTSB data here. So this is a note that they found on the scene, a piece of paper. And if you notice, need to order an autopilot book. So you wonder how confidence, and this is on 5/20, so this is 14 days after the completion of training. So still clearly building confidence in the airplane and dealing with, how to fly the plane optimally. And this was some of the other notes that they found on the website. So just again, cardinal speeds and things like that. And this unfortunately is a picture of the plane coming down after it had broken apart. So, I mean, lessons learned here were, I don't know how you as a person know what you don't know about how much training is enough. But clearly this was a big lesson for me when I was reading this, but me when I was doing my type rating in the Eclipse was when I used SimCom 3 times in 3 years, as I did 3 plane transitions, and each time I had very little data on weather, especially as I moved into a turboprop. I had no data on weather or no instruction on weather. I just was doing training in Florida and they were teaching me how to avoid thunderstorms, but that was about it. So I think this person suffered from thinking that the program was comprehensive and wasn't aware of what wasn't going to be covered and what their role had to be in making sure they had a good strategy on how not to go into weather that would be challenging, or how even to define what is challenging weather. So I think everyone, hopefully everyone listening here has developed personal minimums on weather. But if you've not, it's obviously very important to do. And I'm ultra conservative. I'll cancel flights thinking that the moderate icing report is probably going to be worse than moderate. So, again, was this person proficient to fly the plane? Probably, but probably not to do cross countries and weather that would be challenging. And in this particular case, there was no requirement for mentors or supervised flight training. Lex, you do a lot of that in the Cirrus?
Yes, and in the Vision Jet too, there's a 25-hour supervised operating experience, for higher altitude capability and so forth. So, the general suggestion would be to get with an instructor and take some fairly routine actual IMC trips and work through the weather on the way. And if it's not workable, make the decision not to fly and get help. One of the questions in the Q&A was about, as a new instrument pilot, what are the things that go wrong most often? And, if you're new to the airplane or new to instrument flying in the airplane, it's task saturation and, not being able to stay ahead of the airplane and stay ahead of the weather situation, especially single pilot, right? So fly with a mentor, take it slow, and, work your way around the weather or don't fly if it makes sense. So
Yeah, so I think in turboprops in particular, because when I moved into the Meridian, but also my friends that moved into a Pilatus, we didn't have any supervised flight time requirements at all. They just said, "Oh, you're passed. You know how to fly. You can do approaches and you can do steep turns, and you're doing okay in stalls, and you're good to go."
right,
Um, and insurance wasn't imposing anything either, but as soon as you get into a Cirrus jet or an Eclipse, all of a sudden now you're required to do mentoring. But that mentoring isn't still not doing weather and long cross countries and all kinds of weather. It's again doing approaches and very
yeah,
basic stuff. So it's really important to find the right mentors to give you to go flying with and to learn from them. And I think that's a gap in our training system today.
yeah.
Um,
I mean the Cirrus factory SOE for the Vision Jet is has line items for pretty much everything you might encounter. Convective weather, high altitude takeoffs and landings, icing, short runways, all sorts of stuff. So
yeah,
that's
it's hard to find weather though necessarily to go fly in, and I
well,
think
most
that's
of the time they take you all over the country. So, if you're lucky, even if you're unlucky, you'll probably run into weather depending on the time of year.
and then
So
into
it's
something.
usually a 25-hour cross country extravaganza.
Well, yeah. I think the Cirrus probably is the most complete syllabus of anybody out there right now. And, so I think again, back in 2012, there were still a lot of tools available that would have let us know that there could be icing, and this is just an example of some of the output from different tools.
Hey, Mark, speaking of tools available, one question is asking, are ATC advisories searchable by location?
Yes. So that was that one page earlier on where the North American aviation, the airspace, you can look up. Here, I'll just go back there. Go here. Whoops. There we go. The Air Traffic Control System Command Center. So you can look there. And you can look here. So, and find, specific areas.
Great, thanks. And I'll make sure the links are shared in the chat.
Good, thanks. Go back down here.
I think the other thing to add to it in the evaluation is day or night, because in the daytime you have a lot more tools, and taking off into weather at night is, a very much more complicated process than you're used to. So you wouldn't, you'd avoid that where you can.
Yeah, that Twin Texas example, they took off at 9 o'clock at night. It was dark. So I don't know about you, but I like, if I'm flying around thunderstorms, I like to be able to look out the window and see them, or at least see some aspect of what's going on instead of just lightning flashes and clouds. So that person had to have a lot of confidence in their ability as a pilot to want to do that. It didn't say whether they had onboard radar, but even with onboard radar, if I'm having to use my radar to make tactical decisions, I usually say I failed because I should have a strategic plan to avoid being that close. So,
well, and you're much more susceptible to spatial disorientation.
You are. So going back to the training here too, just for a quick second, what lulls us into thinking that our training is good enough? There was an interesting bit of research done after this accident to say there had only been 20 accidents that were related to the pilot having not enough experience. And in this particular plane, there's only 4 that reference pilot having lack of instrument experience. So there wasn't a notable feeling in the community that training was a big issue or number of hours were a big issue. And that's where you get lulled into thinking that unless you've heard about it, it's not a problem and I'm okay. We really need to just be coming up with our own personal minimums for this kind of situation.
Hey, Mark, just one thing I'd say too is there's a couple of questions in the Q&A about weaknesses. What weaknesses do we see for new instrument pilots just out of training? And I'd say one thing that I think your presentations illustrate really well on the positive side is early on, people just tend, what I see as new instruments pilots just tend to do what they're told by ATC. Whereas we can see from your examples that negotiation with ATC to get the best optimal route is a big part of it. I see that. That takes some confidence as an instrument pilot. So new pilots often just do what they're told, but as you get more experience, you learn to negotiate more to get what you want and how
Yeah,
to do that.
and we shouldn't be afraid to use the emergency word.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
Air traffic control is well intentioned, but they don't see what you see and they don't feel the bumps that you're feeling. So if you are feeling uncomfortable about anything, it's your job to get into a space where you are comfortable, right? So um, I think in one of the scenarios that I reviewed in a prior session, I had an emergency and I was a 150-hour pilot at a DA-42 in heavy rain, and I had a engine fire detection go off, and in this diamond, the rule was turn off the autopilot and hand fly. So hand flying single engine in heavy rain down to minimums into Atlantic City at the time without any plates out, um, and extremely stressed out. And what they told me when I first declared the emergency is that, oh, we have to turn you away from the airport for traffic. And I was like, what? So I just said yes, of course. And today I would just say no. It was just no, that was not a good idea. I want to get on the ground like now. So little things like that you learn with gray hair or no hair. I think I pulled most of mine out. Um, but also I thought it would be good just to share tools here in order of when you're looking at something. So, days out, you can begin to look at outlooks. And these are examples of different websites. And I sent Carly a PDF of these. So she should have put it in the chat. And then to look at, day before or day of, look at where the storms are building or weakening, and you can sort of get an idea of where they're going to go. And there's an interesting thing that if you've not used it before, there's a pre-duty controller briefing that comes out in different regions. And it's actually a video of someone and a recording of someone giving a briefing that controllers would be using to understand what weather to expect during their shift. And it's for all over the country. So I listen to the Boston one on a regular basis. It's extremely helpful. And then you can look at, again, the forecaster discussions as well as the TAF. Aviationweather.gov has gotten much better with the most recent releases. So you can find most everything there, including route profiles, which can be kind of interesting if you're looking at icing. So I think we somehow magically used up a full hour. So if anyone has any remaining questions, please let me know. I appreciate everyone doing these or listening in on these. It's a lot of fun to do these, and we appreciate your participation in being a safer pilot.